Thank you for really interesting presentations, and I think it'll spur a lot of discussion. I wanted to ask quite a sort of high-level question to start. Sorry, my name is Emma Wilson, and I'm an independent researcher affiliated with the University of Cambridge. And I've worked quite a lot on these particular issues, mostly in the Arctic. And it's really good to see this selection of people on the panel and to get these different perspectives. I wanted to sort of ask about the overall purpose of the meeting, who you're trying to influence, and also this question of subnational, local level research and understanding about the governance of extractives. You did say that it's been very understudied, and I wanted to make the point that it's been studied a lot by anthropologists, social scientists, political scientists over many, many years. And I wanted to know whether the question was really that people looking at the governance at the high level have not engaged quite as much with researchers at these levels who are working at the local level, and also with local level players and civil society. And perhaps both Daniel and Jamie could comment on that, because I know Jamie's been working on these issues for years and engaging with researchers who do a lot of field work and so on. And possibly the others have something to say about that question too.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. My name's Daniel Wild and I work at the Commonwealth Secretariat. I just wanted to ask a question about the different functions of governance. Obviously, there are numerous different functions and processes in the governance of the extractive industry. There's licensing, there's physical monitoring, there's environmental concerns, there's taxation, there's the development of local content policies, there's revenue management of the money that's collected by taxation. Do any of the panel members have a strong view on if there are particular functions which should always or nearly always be at the national level, and particular functions which should always or nearly always be at the federal level or subnational level? Thank you.
And one last question from...
Yeah, hi, I'm Eddie Rich from the EITI. Thanks very much to the panelists. I thought it was a great discussion, and well done to NRGI for the paper. I think, again, really, really insightful and important to bring all that study together. I'm hearing, I think, a consistent message from that paper and from the panelists, which was a clear expression of the importance of the subnational distinction, and a little bit more about the distinction of challenges between the national and the subnational, but not quite so much. I mean, so it's important, but some distinctions and some of the issues which are actually, I recognise completely from the national level as well. They're just repeated. But I hear much, much less about the prescriptions until we got onto Jamie's discussion. And so Zainab and Rani talked about Nigeria and Indonesia, but I still struggle with, when you're talking about 11,000 local governments, and you hear Jamie's sort of solutions that, we need social assessments and perception analysis and so on. I'm thinking, whoa, that's heavy. That's really, it has to be somehow systematized, and that keeps going back to national government. And I'm still struggling where, we as international community, if that's what we are, can try and help systematize some of that.
Okay, great, thanks. I guess, Emma, I'll just explain a little bit the purpose of the meeting. So NRGI have they spent several years researching whether there needs to be an increased focus at the subnational level and what are the research gaps. So I guess the purpose of the meeting was to promote that work, but then also ask whether we all should be working more at the subnational level, or is there a danger that if the focus moves completely to the subnational level, then we're missing issues at the national level. So it's to explore those issues. and to really bring out the challenges, I guess, the complexities of a subnational focus. So then your question about is it that the people who've been working on governance just haven't been engaging at the local level, whereas there's actually been lots of people who have been looking at this.
Okay.
Do you want to jump in
Can
there?
I jump in there?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I didn't mention this in my talk, but actually the report, there's a footnote that says we aren't covering environment and human rights issues. And I think that's the disconnect there, is that they're covering revenue management and licensing. And so we as geographers and anthropologists and what have you typically don't look at those governance aspects. We look more at the environmental and the social impacts, which will include livelihood impacts, human rights impacts. And I think there's work to be done to perhaps, or maybe NRGI is choosing not to look down that road because other people are doing it. So I'd be interested to hear from NRGI on why there's that gap there, because I agree with Emma. There has been a gap in the NRGI's work in the past. Not to mention that climate change isn't mentioned anywhere. And I think in terms of normative frameworks, that one's got to be in the discussion as well in terms of local impacts and local risk assessment. So I just throw that in there before Danny goes.
Could I just, the question of governance at the local level very much relates to those questions. Sorry. Sorry.
Can we have a mic here?
I didn't want to say too much, but yeah. Yeah, I think the question is that governance actually relates to those questions that have been done possibly without a governance slant. And so this question of talking more broadly about governance, more localised, is becoming really, it's a huge opportunity now, I think, yeah.
Okay, Danny, I think there's plenty there for you to address.
Well, I would also encourage my colleagues who have worked so much on that, led by Matteo, to please complement me. But first, I think it's really important to note how much work and research has been done in general at the subnational level and local level. I even did my dissertation. One of my mentors was an anthropologist, and it comes from the Mexico days and other countries. So it's incredibly important work. So to Emma's comment, and that's on social and environmental issues and related. Our focus has indeed been at the more regulatory, economic, institutional level, and we have been very clear that those social and environmental issues are absolutely crucial, but that's not an area where we have had the expertise in the past. It's something that we need together to work together and integrate better, but our organization has not been focused, and we have on occasion collaborated with with other organizations that have much more expertise. So we're very clear that that's not an area, because we don't like to talk about something that we don't have expertise, but it's incredibly important. The same with climate change. I mean, we have been having very intensive internal discussions about the implications of climate change for how we go forward and for the regulatory economic expertise work we do. But we are not going to pretend that overnight we're expert on climate change. We draw from the others. And it would have been intellectually not very honest to then present a lot on those issues that where there are others that have done a lot. On the more economic regulatory aspects in terms of governance management, revenue sharing issues, sovereign wealth funds at the local level and so on, I would still suggest that there has been, relatively speaking, an understudy. So we were contributing to particular components that we felt were understudied. You're both absolutely right that there has to be more of an effort to integration. And there, I wanted to, following James' comment about innovations at the local level, and Eddie being here from Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, maybe you will find it too provocative. I don't think that the most important aspect of EITI is what's happening internationally at the board and all those norms, but it's what's happening at the national level. And one of the greatest innovations of EITI, and then later OGP and others have taken it, as opposed to the classic approach. I used to be at the World Bank or the UN and so on, which was, we call it the disease governmentitis, just dealing with governments, and in some cases just with the Minister of Finance. These are MSIs in terms of multi-stakeholder initiative. Far from perfect, but it is a breakthrough compared with the global governance architecture in terms of many of these initiatives in the past. The MSGs now, multi-sectoral groups, it's not just in the board where we are. I represent civil society, and Zainab is from government, and the other from industry. But most importantly, this is now mirrored at every country at the national level, with different degrees of challenges and perfection. Let me put it on the table, and for the James, so for yourself, so the world, I think it would be really important of this mushrooming also at the subnational level. We are helping in some contexts. EITI itself cannot do it for the reasons Eddie was hinting. I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands of flowers into bloom. But this notion of industry, governments, and civil society getting around the table and trying to arrive at consensus on those absolutely crucial issues, I think has been a very important innovation, which in a case like in Colombia has brought to the fore and basically made a very potent case within EITI that these social and environmental issues are very important. So because it's an element of innovation that is allowed in EITI, there's a voluntariness and it's not forced upon everybody else. There are countries like Colombia that are taking the lead in saying, well, these issues are key also and need to be integrated. And of course we welcome that, but we don't always have the expertise on that.
Sure, go ahead.
Part of the questions that Eddie read was, what are the challenges at the subnational level, and then what are the prescriptions? The part of the challenges, and Ronnie has mentioned this also, is the ownership also of the resources. We don't have the kind of complexity that Indonesia had, but we have had a situation where two states were contesting one oil block, because there is derivation revenue that comes from those blocks that are situated in a state. After a very extended case that went up to the Supreme Court, it was decided in favor of one state. So that's one challenge that you find at the subnational level, which you won't find at the federal level. Because in our case, the resource is owned by the federal government, the asset was not sterilized, it continued to produce. When the decision was taken, the derivation revenue goes to the state that won the case. There's also the challenge of inadequate capacity of civil society that is more pronounced at the state and the local government level. There's, of course, the environmental challenges that is at the state level, not so much at the federal level. Then the responsibilities of the operating companies to the communities is a challenge that the communities have because of lack of capacity for them to be able to adequately relate with the companies. We have a requirement for companies to go into community development agreements, and they're supposed to negotiate it with the community. So oftentimes the companies are simply doling out handouts or deciding what they need to do, and the communities are not getting the best benefit because they are limited in their capacity to be able to sit on the table and negotiate well with the company. So what the prescriptions should be in terms of ownership, there should be very, very simple and clear regulations that will limit as much as possible the overlap. And then in terms of inadequacy of the capacity of civil society, I'm glad that actually a lot of multilateral development partners, at least in Nigeria, are giving more support now directly to civil society than to government agencies, because they recognize the role that the civil society need to play, and the inadequacy of their capacity was hindering the completion of that role. The community development agreements are important, but they can be driven better if the MSG structure that EITI has popularized is taken down to the community level. If it is taken down to then the communities can now ramp up their capacity to be able to negotiate adequately with the operating companies.
Okay, great. I'm just going to put that question about prescriptions to Rani as well to see if you have anything to contribute there. I'm focusing in particular on what is different about the prescriptions at the subnational level in comparison to general prescriptions that we have about improving the governance of extractives.
Well, actually, in the term of national planning in Indonesia, it's already regulated. Everything is bottom up. So we have now a regulation on the village, law on village, that going to take the policy going to be taken in very bottom level. So I think we should see this the difference between national and this subnational. It's going to be there's a question about the distribution of the revenue. I think now the central government collect the revenues and distribute the revenues, but without any solution when the revenues becoming so little because of the price are now slumped. But yes, I think the prescription going to be different in national level. We need to have a breakthrough or something to at least, once again I said, stabilize this revenue distribution. And also, according to the national planning, we should see until the next 3 years what happened with Indonesia, because if the policy going to be bottom up, but the decision to whether to open this area to business or not, it depends on the national level, because of lack of the capacity for the national government to know what is the actual value of the deposit. We have a bidding approach. Maybe, I don't know, the one who have a bidding approach will be Australia, but it's different. So we haven't opened any area to be bid, but we should see this empowerment of the local government to for the next Indonesian mining decentralization. So.
Okay, great. And then we have the question about which functions of governance are nearly always better managed at national level, and which functions are better managed at the subnational level. Do you want
I'd
to
make
comment?
a comment, certainly, and I'm going to betray my bias here as a geologist and explorer, and talking in particular about the administration, the cadastral system, the administration of licenses, but perhaps importantly, not forgetting that the collection of exploration, geological data, etc., is a key part of developing the natural resource base of countries. And my own bias certainly is that certainly should be centralised, not least because the capacity and capability required these days to manage the scale of data sets that is involved in large scale, for example, geophysical data collection, etc. You want to avoid the duplication of trying to have that at the local level and the national level in order to promote the maximum dissemination of information, in order to promote exploration and development. So certainly from my perspective, that is a key area that, in my opinion, is much better served by having one centralised facility that, let's say, an investor like ourselves can go to, a one-stop shop, really, for getting information about the prospectivity of a country, for example.
Okay.
Can I add to that? I know that was your question, Daniel. But for a bit of provocation, I don't think there's so many issues where one has to draw such a distinction. I mean, one could go to the extreme, and I'm originally an economist, a macroeconomist, and say exchange rate policy, which is crucial in these issues, and as Nigeria knows painfully well right now. It's obviously central government, but we're playing with mirrors, and often distorted mirrors at the subnational level, which we don't fully recognize. What's the mirror to the exchange rate at the subnational level? Is a relative public sector to private sector wage. What's happening in localities that all of a sudden started extracting and mining. Peru is such a potent, distorted case. And because of the revenue sharing rules, municipalities all of a sudden got 500 times more money in the budget than they had before, 500-fold. Basically it goes to the local government. And we have not discussed, I totally agree with you, the political economy at the local level, local capture, I would also stress. What happens there? Everything is captured by local government. Public works and vested interests start, they basically take over the whole employment wage bill and totally crowds out the private sector. The relative wages between the public sector and private sector gets totally distorted, and that creates a major issue. That's in some sense equivalent domestically, exchange of what's happening there. So I would extend or have a variant of your question and say, okay, of those issues which traditionally are totally central government, are there mirrors we should be looking at the subnational level? The other example I would bring, and I wonder what's your comment, Rani, is Indonesia. The fantastic case of Bojonegoro on the one hand, with enlightened leadership and so on, trying to manage those the major oil windfall, and now it's in times of trouble because of the oil prices having gone down. This is how oil rich communities started getting the fruits of that. Yet, my understanding is that the central government and other political factors, they are still constraining Bojonegoro in terms of fully creating their own sovereign wealth funds. So sovereign wealth funds would usually think about them as something national, but these localities in very often have much more volatility than at the national level because of when they are very oil rich, and they want to manage the whole savings and expenditure function in a very responsible fashion. Yet they are not necessarily allowed by the central rules to have the same institutional initiatives that are at the center. So that's why I would expand the question and say, okay, those institutions which have to be at a central level and they have to function well, including the clarity of the rules and so on, in what way they have to exist, and we have to help them also develop at the local level, suitably adjusted. And sovereign wealth funds would be one, and I know that there's still a politics going on regarding a sovereign wealth funds for Bojonegoro. Alaska is another case. They ran into big trouble recently after having many successes, so even in very developed settings, and Alaska with her own fund and how they distribute it. So I just wanted to bring out the issue that we need to think further, and it's still many areas are underexplored of how these institutions need to be also developed at the subnational level, not just at the central.
Okay, I just want to take some questions from our online participants, and I have a question here that maybe Zainab you can speak to. It's from Otenye Davies, public relations practitioner from Nigeria, and he asks, is it possible that we end up having corruption and lack of accountability? The corruption and lack of accountability at the national level is replaced by corruption and lack of accountability at the local level in even more hard to monitor dimensions.
That's a very important question. And but let me just say, Davis, that the corruption and lack of accountability we have in Nigeria is not just more at the national level, it's also at the state levels. The more a state gets revenue it was not expecting and it has not planned for, the more the likelihood of corruption. So if a state earns revenue from taxes, it's more likely to be more accountable and less corrupt than if it earns revenue from just derivation due to extractive activity. So the source of revenue is important, and the management of revenue is important at all levels, but how the revenue accrues also counts for, at least in our environment, has shown a great deal that it counts. In Lagos State, for example, where the state now has very, very high internally generated revenue, there has been significant records of improvement in accountability because the revenues are from taxes that are collected from industries and from people rather than from the sharing of the revenue formula that comes from the center.
Okay. I have another question here, which is for James from Alex Tiernan from Christian Aid. And she wants to know about experiences he's undertaking with perception analysis to better understand community narrative.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a methodology, really. It's a methodology question about how one goes about doing that research, and I think it's important to do. But we go to companies, communities, and local government and ask them the very same questions, their interactions with the oil sector, whether or not they benefit, what barriers there are to those benefits, and what recommendations they might have. We call it a social relations and perception analysis. And after going through that process, we then put all the data on flip charts, bring all representatives of communities, villages, and all the representatives together to discuss the findings. Where you find mismatches in those perceptions are possible areas to actually work to build consensus. And so then the next stage of that is multi-stakeholder processes. So there's various ways to do perception analysis, but that's the way that our group has been doing them over the years.
It sounds quite familiar. Sounds quite similar to the stakeholder engagement part of ESIA. Would you say there's a distinction?
I think we go in without trying to fill boxes, if you will. So the data that emerges is the data that emerges, and it's inductive. It's purely inductive, and so there's very little from a top-down framework that's being imposed on that. I think the problem with ESIAs is when one's done, oftentimes we see they're very similar between different oil blocks, and so in terms of the cookie-cutter approach to ESIAs, so and also there's big challenges about transparency and access to ESIAs and participation in ESIAs. But this is purely a participatory process, basically being led by the people that are partaking in it.
Yeah. Okay, we're almost out of time, but as we started a little late, I'll just take one more round of maybe 3 questions, and if we can just answer them very briefly before we go for lunch. George, is a question here?
Thanks. Edward Bickham, formerly of Anglo-American and formerly of EITI. These days I advise a number of oil, gas and mining companies. And it's really good to see the work that's being done on the subnational level, because for many years it was regarded as something of a sideshow and really not what something sort of serious economists would be worrying themselves about. And yet, if one's looking at development outcomes, it's critical that one gets the regional and local levels right. So one of the things we've been doing through EITI is the tracking of revenues, that the law may say X% of the revenues will go back to the region, and for years no one really knew whether that was happening or not. And increasingly through EITI, that problem is being addressed. I think, Danny, you mentioned that in relation to Ghana. And a tendency also in many situations where there is an extractive sector for the government to exit and effectively say, you can be the government around here, and that's profoundly bad both for accountability and for the companies concerned. But a key point I think that emerges is that capacity is critical. Capacity to actually govern and administer and deliver services, and we're seeing the problems in South Africa about the delivery of services, even when revenues are available. A number of people mentioned Peru. The Canon Minero, huge amounts of money pouring out of local government ears, and yet it was being misspent on football stadiums, town halls, and whatever else. But it wasn't actually feeding through to the village level. So one needs to have accountability and capacity, and actually, therefore, the whole issue of ensuring that there are parallel structures, the sorts of participative processes one has through EITI at the national level, that those should be replicated as far as possible at the local level, is critical. There's just one example from experience at Anglo-American. We knew that one community in Brazil, Barro Alto in Goiás state, was going to have its revenues increased by about 20-fold. And there we knew it was going to happen in about 5 years. And so we worked with the local administration in bringing in civil society to build their capacity to be able to manage those sorts of things. And although it's not the sort of thing that a company generally does, in terms of producing much better use of money, much more harmonious outcomes, it was really an initiative that was well worthwhile.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, so maybe just one more question, and if you can keep it succinct, that would be great. We have a question here.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Michelle Chavunga, formerly British Bankers Association, looking at business finance. My question really is for Minister Zainab. I'm just really curious in terms of what measures have been put in place for states that haven't necessarily performed that well in terms of transparency and revenue management as well. And then I also wanted to understand whether there are any measures in place to deal with the capacity issues that she highlighted. Thank you.
That's for you.
Oh, okay. What we've done, and this is what we've done. Okay, let me step back a bit. What the Nigerian EITI tried to do was to create awareness, to enable the states, citizens at the state to have information to be able to advocate for improvement in governance of revenues. But what we did that is most recent, and this is following the slump in the crude oil prices, and in our case also the significant level of reduction of oil production as a result of vandalization, is we found ourselves in a situation where states were in dire straits economically. States were unable to pay salaries for months. So the federal government had to give the states bailout packages, but those bailout packages were given with conditions that you must meet some basic physical measures, such as you must have, the state must publish its audited accounts, you must put in place fiscal responsibility acts, you must audit its payroll, you must have a clear implementation of Federal Freedom of Information Act, things like that, that will naturally and also transit into the IPSAs as opposed to the cash accounting that most states are carrying out now. So these processes are ongoing. So these monies are given out with those conditions being met. Some of them were met, but some of them we had to negotiate short to medium term timelines for the states to meet. That is improving the governance, the management of resources at the state levels as we speak.
Okay, great. So I think there was lots of really interesting points raised in this debate. I want to extend my thanks to the panelists. I think bringing the perspectives from Indonesia, Uganda, Nigeria was really helpful. And I guess what I take away from this is that there does seem to be a demand at the community level for improved governance of extractives at the local or subnational level, and we saw how there was a huge response to the report that EITI Nigeria produced, which was focused at the state level. And we heard from James how there is an onus on us to do more to understand the narratives at the local level and understand the political dynamics so that we can respond to not just what NGOs at the national level are saying, but also NGOs and civil society are saying at the local level. But then we also heard from the perspective of companies there is a need for, there is a role for the national government to provide coordination and centralisation of some aspects of governance of extractives, and in particular the centralisation of data on cadastres. And I guess the example of Indonesia shows us how a decentralisation without control from the centre can go horribly wrong. So I think lots of lessons there. I think there's probably plenty more space for research, particularly, as James pointed out, including environmental climate change and social issues more into this question of the governance of extractives, and also looking at what are the things that we need to get right at the national level so that a focus at the subnational level can happen. I'd like to thank you, the audience, some great questions, and to those of you online. I'm sorry I didn't get to read out all the questions that were coming through online. There just wasn't enough time. There is lunch outside, so I invite you to join us and continue the conversation. We will be in touch with a summary and a link to the film, and I hope you'll continue this debate with us in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.